Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Jason Keeler with the SANS Institute and I'll be moderating this webcast. This special SANS webcast is a preview of the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit being held March 22nd, 2013 in Washington, D.C. Conventional network defense tools such as intrusion detection systems and antivirus focus on the vulnerability component of risk, and traditional incident response methodology presupposes a successful intrusion. An evolution in the goals and sophistication of computer network intrusions has rendered these approaches insufficient for the threats facing many modern networked organizations. A new class of adversaries, appropriately dubbed the Advanced Persistent Threat, otherwise known as APT, represents well-resourced and trained adversaries that conduct multi-year intrusion campaigns targeting highly sensitive and valuable data in an attempt to gain a competitive edge, particularly in international business and law or nation-state political and military affairs. These adversaries accomplish their goals using advanced tools and techniques designed to circumvent most conventional computer network defense mechanisms and remain undetected in their intrusion efforts or presence on networks over long periods of time. Network defense techniques which leverage knowledge about these adversaries, known as cyber threat intelligence, can enable defenders to establish a state of information superiority which decreases the adversary's likelihood of success with each subsequent intrusion attempt. Threat intelligence can be a force multiplier as organizations look to update their security programs and defenses to deal with increasingly sophisticated advanced persistent threats. Security managers need accurate, timely, and detailed information to continuously monitor new and evolving attacks and methods to exploit this information in furtherance of an improved defensive posture. Make no mistake about it, contemporary computer network defense contains a strong element of intelligence and counterintelligence that analysts and managers alike must understand and leverage. The goal of this summit will be to equip attendees with knowledge on the tools, methodologies, and processes they need to move forward with cyber threat intelligence. The SANS What Works and Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit will bring attendees who are eager to hear this information and learn about tools, techniques, and solutions that can help address these needs. Today's webcast features Rick Holland, a senior analyst from Forrester Research, and his special presentation on cyber threat intelligence called If It Bleeds, We Can Kill It, Leveraging Cyber Threat Intelligence to Take the Fight to the Adversary. And before we turn things over to Rick, the Q&A portion will take place at the end of the webcast. However, please feel free to submit your questions at any point by using the chat window. Right now, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, Rick Holland.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm excited to do a SANS webcast, and it's a really appropriate topic, just looking what went down earlier this week as well. So to get started, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about myself. I'm a senior analyst with Forrester. I've been here about a year and a half. Prior to that, I was a sales engineer with a large North American security reseller. But my background as a practitioner before that was in incident response. So I actually kind of cut my teeth in IR in higher education, which was a pretty, if anyone's ever worked in EDU, you kind of appreciate what type of environment that was. And then the other piece that I think is kind of appropriate for this topic is I have a military intelligence background. I joined the Army straight out of high school, and I spent 4.5 years as an intel analyst. And so a lot of what I talk about when I talk about intelligence is I kind of leverage a military perspective on it. So let's go ahead and get started. There's no doubt 2013 has been a rough year, right? We're barely into the year. Everyone was calling 2011 the year of the breach, and then 2012 the year of the breach. And I don't know what we're going to call 2013, but it's been rough. Now, as you can see, it's got a predator theme to this. So I thought I'd do is look at some of these fallen soldiers and match them up to the big names that have just been hit in the first 2 months, not even full complete months of the year. It's been pretty painful. There's no doubt about it. I'm a geek. You know, everyone likes to talk about threat landscape. I thought I'd throw a little twist by throwing Predator in it. And like I said, I'm a big fan of Predator. Not so much Aliens versus Predator. It sounds great on paper, but in reality, not so good. Kind of reminds me of NAC, actually. Great concept, not so practical. Kind of moving along, our tactics aren't working. We're shooting at the ground level. We're not hitting where the Predator is. We've got some great tools. Check out Old Painless here. Mac here put 200 rounds in the minigun and didn't get a lot of damage done. And if you look at the vendor landscape of what we've got going on, advanced malware, no problem. We've got Bit9. Well, we know what happened to Bit9. I mean, we've got FireEye. We've got a lot of solutions that claim to be advanced malware. The keys to solving the advanced malware problem, but really they're just tools. And if we all realize, right, if a determined attacker wants to get you, they're going to get you. And I think that's where we can kind of leverage threat intelligence to help us out. So we know the bad guys are weak, right? Our controls today are doing a little bit of damage, but we're not closing the deal. So we have to change our practice. Just like Dutch used the mud, had to get a new approach, it's time for us to get a new approach. You know, and the one thing that was lucky for Dutch in Predator that he wasn't up against a next generation Predator, which we saw in Predator 2, because in Predator 2 we were able to see in multiple visual spectrums. So Dutch's mud trick probably wouldn't have worked against the Predator in Predator 2. And this is probably a good analogy about how the strategy and tactics of the attackers are going to change. So we always have to be adopting our strategy. So let's move into the topic of what we want to talk about today, and that's cyber threat intelligence. Information intelligence about external threat actors and active external threats. So what does this mean? This is actually a pet peeve of mine in some regards, partly because of my background on it. But in the spring of last year, I wrote this blog called My Threat Intelligence Can Beat Up Your Threat Intelligence. Because as you can imagine, as an analyst, I talk to lots of vendors. I get the PowerPoint decks, and every single time I would talk to a vendor, I would see some type of slide like I created here. Unparalleled world-class threat intelligence, global coverage, over 100 companies, 4 billion emails a month, 60,000 million, whatever numbers you want to come up with of web transaction, emails, users, whatever, and that's the footprint. And ta-da, that's intelligence. My contention is that's not intelligence. I get that the vendors, the product vendors and the service players out there have these large networks, and they're collecting data from them, and they're doing analytics on that. I would in some ways call that a little bit commoditized. That's or global intelligence. What I'm interested in is local intelligence to my organization. So I still to this day, a lot of vendors I talk to are familiar with this blog, and I still bring it up when I see things that come out that we're talking about intelligence as a differentiator. And for a lot of these vendors, it's not a differentiator. What I would tell them is, you know, your threat intelligence network is probably not a lot different than your closest competitor. You know, the McAfee to the Symantec, pretty similar footprints, similar types of devices. They're going to see similar information. The network guys and the endpoint guys, their intelligence networks, are going to have different perspectives of the same problems. But what I want is what I would call that local intelligence, and I want to know how this intelligence was derived. And here's where you're going to see kind of my perspective from the military coming back in. So this is the intelligence cycle, and it's a little bit different depending on what countries, intelligence organizations you look at. Even within the U.S., you might see FBI have something different here than versus maybe someone in the Department of Defense. But largely, it's the same concept. The steps may be a little bit different. But I think the first important piece here is the planning and direction. This is where the process gets started and where it ends. And the important piece here is business goals. I want to know how the intelligence that I'm going to derive ties into the business. What does the business need? Are we expanding into a new geography? Okay, what kind of intelligence efforts do we need to make to support and protect those endeavors? It also closes the loop. So to use another military term of after-action review, you know, after we've had a particular incident, whatever the case may be, we want to close the loop. How effective were the steps of this process? What can we learn from it? And always close the loop. You know, collection, next step. Obviously, we're going to collect intelligence. We could collect it ourselves or rely on other parties to collect it. But once again, this collection is going to be based on our specific business requirements. And you'll hear me talking throughout this process about business needs and justification and kind of building up the program. Processing, next step, is absolutely critical. This is where we're leveraging technology, right? We know that we have problems with staff. We have to have staff involved, but they can't do everything. So we need to automate our collection. We need to automate our analysis and do data deduplication, clean it up, and make it much more digestible for an analyst that's looking at it. And then the analyst actually looks at it. And this is, sorry, I got ahead of myself. This is the most important step, I think, in the process, with defining the business objectives probably as the second piece, is the actual analysis. This is where data or information becomes intelligence. And this is what I challenge many people that say they're providing intelligence, is that it's not really intelligence. It could be the equivalent of the 1990s untuned IDS, which I am still a big fan of IDS. IDS is not dead. Get that little plug in there. So that's where the analysis key. So we're going to use the tools and technology to make the analysis easier. And then we're going to produce. We need to produce. I think of production in two different levels: tactical operational production and then strategic production. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. And then finally, dissemination. We have to get the intelligence out. What good is intelligence? Think about the 9/11, the disconnect between the FBI and the data that they had that didn't get out. Or maybe it was a CIA that didn't get to the FBI. So this information has to get out to the appropriate people, or it has no value. For me, I think this is the important part of dissemination, and I'll say throughout this I'm a big proponent of sharing, and I'll talk about ways that we actually want to go about sharing in a good manner. Intelligence disciplines. So there's many intelligence disciplines out there. SIGINT, COMET, ELINT. What I thought I would do is focus on the disciplines that I think are most appropriate for organizations to use. And I'm an Army guy, so I'm basing this off of Army Field Manual 2.0 on intelligence, and you'll see similar things from anyone else that you look at. But open source intelligence, and I won't read this whole thing for you, but this is information that's publicly available. I kind of laugh about it now. When I was in the Army, OSINT for us was CNN. The internet was just in its infancy. It wasn't like it is today, where we're able to do OSINT analysis on APT1 from the information that was released earlier this week. But OSINT's going to be a component of your intelligence team. If you move on, and then we've got human intelligence, and this is also the definition from FM. Field Manual 2 for the Army. So this is where the human element comes in. And on the human side, there are some things that organizations will do, sock puppets, for example, creating personalities. But once again, you may rely on a service to provide you human intelligence versus standing that capability up yourself. The third one that I wanted to talk about was just counterintelligence, CI. And CI actually came out from this definition of counterintelligence came out from an executive order that Ronald Reagan signed talking about covert intelligence activities. And we're going to talk a little bit more about counterintelligence as we move through the next slides. I wanted to touch on a couple of the buzzwords that we hear in this space. And one of the things that I did when I was putting together this deck was, I kind of leveraged some of the research I've done on standing up programs. I also looked at the agenda for the Threat Summit and kind of wanted to have a pretty broad swath of things to talk about. And one thing that you hear a lot of debate about is attribution. And some people will claim that attribution is ultimately what you want from intelligence, and it's more than just attribution. Attribution is important. A lot of people that I talk to, still aren't even open necessarily to the idea of intelligence yet. Why do I need to know who is attacking me? I think it's important to know if you've got a sniper going after you, or if that bullet was from a drive-by that went around. But attribution isn't easy. If you read, it came out I think yesterday from Forbes, a follow-up interview with Richard Bailick talking about APT1 wasn't even their special forces. It was easier to do attribution on those guys because they were sloppy. So attribution isn't easy, and it takes time. And the way that you build up that kind of database of attribution is observing the tactics, techniques, and procedures of the attackers over time. I think it's important, but attribution alone isn't intelligence. I actually think that the IOCs, the indicators of compromise, are a very, very important component of this. If you move on, this is another topic highly debated. In fact, each of these could probably be entire webcasts. I know conference talks alone on these topics. Offensive security, hacking back. I absolutely think we need to drop the word offensive security. We don't need to be doing this. There's legal questions to it. There's unintended targets, unintended results. Do you really want to get in an escalating situation with an adversary when you're striking back against them? I firmly believe that. Now, I am for your Fortune 500s, for your typical enterprises, we don't need to get into this endeavor. If you're a three-level, if you're DoD, if you're CIA, if you're NSA, GCHQ, whatever the case may be, or one of the contractors that we see supporting those groups, I think in those circumstances that's fine. But for Mr. Fortune 500, this is not an area that we really need to get on. I think CrowdStrike has kind of confused this a little bit, and I think they've been working on their marketing a little bit. I think there's a lot of opinion if CrowdStrike was going to be the black water of the cyber intel world, and I think to clarify that they're probably more on the counterintelligence type of operations than some of the strike-back stuff. But I just don't like that term, so I don't like to use it, and I don't recommend it to customers. What I do like, and I use the term proactive defense partly because the tactical range I train at is called proactive defense, so it's always stuck in my mind. But this is the active defense. Now, if you haven't seen this webcast, the Paul.com crew did this earlier this week on Monday. I would take a look at it. There's a new distro out, the ADHD, which is basically on active defense. So this has a lot of your tools that would be for your counterintelligence operations, your deception, your annoyance, those types of things. So if you haven't taken a look at that, I highly recommend you do it. There's also a really nice tools usage guide that's got descriptions of the tools that are in this distro, examples on how to use them. Highly recommend you take a look at that. Okay, so let's kind of transition again. Let's tap our brakes, right? Let's talk about why you may not be ready for intelligence. And I think the biggest thing is it's sexy, right? We've been, if you looked at that slide with the companies this year that have gotten hit, we're just taking it, right? It's time to go on the offense. This idea is great. We want to go zero dark 30 on these bad guys. Let's round up the operators and let's go hit them and let's get them back and let's, take the fight to the enemy. In reality, this is what most organizations are. We're doomsday preppers. This is tactical, right? We have all this good gear. We're clearly not in shape. We're in absolutely no condition to conduct offensive operations. We may not even know how to use the weapon systems that we have. So, I would caution you, you want to go run out the gate and move down this route of intelligence to say, are we really ready for that? And just as an example, I thought about a couple areas that I would mention that we need to think about. The first one up is, do you know what assets and people you need to protect? Fundamental question. The majority of clients that I talk to struggle with this. They mostly think about assets and have problems there, and they don't even think about their high-value targets from a personnel perspective. Coming back to CrowdStrike again, CrowdStrike has a tagline that says you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. That's true, but I think your bigger problem is not knowing what data and who you need to protect, and that's where I would start. If you can answer this question, I think you can move on. Most organizations really struggle here. You also have to have mature incident response capabilities. If you can't respond to incidents, if you can't triage incidents, then you really have no business moving on to this kind of more mature capability extension of incident response. Just a couple examples that I think of that organizations need to have is, do you have the ability to do global password changes? All your administrative accounts, your local accounts. Do you able to do that if you have a compromise? Is there a process, technology available to enable that? Do you have the ability to quickly block command and control so that when you've come to the point that you feel confident in putting in blocking mechanisms against these attackers, that you can do it across the organization at one time and make sure that you lock them out completely? This one I think is absolutely huge. I'm doing some research right now on incident response, something along the lines of 10 gotchas of IR or something like that. And one of the things that I talk about in here is the incident response team has to be enabled to make decisions. And this indicates a certain level of maturity within organizations. I remember in my days of doing incident response in some significant attacks, CISO, CIO standing over my shoulder. I'm not able to make a decision without running it up the chain of command. We need to enable our incident response teams to do what they need to do to protect the organization. So if you don't have a lot of process, I've mentioned process quite a bit here, you may not be ready for cyber threat intelligence operations. Now, if you're able to develop and build out CTI capability and these other areas at the same time, then do both. But if you can't do the basics, moving on to the advanced stuff is just going to cause problems. Okay, so the next section that we're going to move on to is actually kind of building out a program. And we'll talk about different steps throughout this process, ranging from sources to tools, a lot of different things of that nature. And we'll also, in a little while, we'll talk about the build versus buy scenario. The first thing is you've got to get buy-in for this. The biggest challenge that I see organization, from my perspective, right, the majority of my conversations are with directors, CISOs, C-level folks within organizations, and the business is trying to do its thing, trying to expand into new geographies, retain customers, get new customers, all the typical things that the organizations do. Security isn't real hot on the list. We slow things down. And if you want to develop a CTI capability, you're going to have to get buy-in from your non-technical business leaders. They may not see a reason to dedicate resources to you or to reprioritize your project list so that you can focus on this. So a couple things that I think are helpful, and I always recommend to my clients when they're talking to them, is that you can use this intelligence to actually communicate risk. What are the actual activities that are occurring to our organization? You start putting together these pictures of these external actors. So, we do this bad thing in security of always talking about, the sky's falling, the sky's falling. Not everyone does that, but just as a broad generalization. Well, if you're able to use intelligence to actually get a real good picture of the threat landscape specific to your organization, your vertical, that's good. So you can communicate that, sure, we won't have this ability up front, but we'll be able to give management this information so that we can better make decisions for the business and how to protect what we're trying to accomplish. And that's kind of the true scope and severity of attacks. You move from this kind of nebulous, we're getting hit, to this is actually what's happening to our organization. One of the key points that I think as well, and we'll talk about this with the cyber kill chain in a little bit as well, is demonstrating return on investment of your previous purchases. I talked about in the intelligence life cycle, the final step and the first step, you have that after action review and you're lining it up with the business. Well, if you have an incident, you go back and look at how well your controls did, what was doing well, what wasn't doing well. You can use that to validate the investment that you've made, or to say, look, I'm not going to pay for this technology because it's not doing as good a job for me. So I think it gives you an opportunity to have a little bit more flexibility in where you spend and see how successful your spend has been. One of the things that I think is important here is that until you have a mature program, this is going to be an ongoing process. You're going to have to bring people on board for it. I did a lot of some of the data that we're talking about in this webcast comes off a piece of research that I did called 5 Steps to build out a intelligence program. And so I did a number of research interviews in that process. And one of the research interviews, I talked to some very mature organizations, technology companies. They've been doing this for 7 years, and it took them a long time before they got good buy-in and there was business value proven from this program. So it's going to take some time. The next part is it's all about analysis, right? We need to staff the team. So we need analysts. But we don't want this analyst. We want Jack Ryan. We don't want that Jack Ryan. We want this Jack Ryan. We want the good Jack Ryan. So the analyst piece is absolutely critical, right? I said in the intelligence lifecycle that analysis piece is where the information becomes intelligence, the actionable intelligence, the buzzword that I'll use. But just because something's a buzzword doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Actual intelligence, APT, those type of things. But this is where some of the investment will come. One of the things that I think this could give you, if you look at the maturity of kind of incident response teams, and particularly those that have suffered from a targeted attack, APT type of attack, is they start building out this capability because they realize their original, first-gen incident response capability isn't working. Well, when you have an intelligence team, you actually build out career pathing. So you can have your level 1 SOC analyst that you bring in, and they're looking at the dashboards. And then you have your kind of day-to-day incident response guys. Then you have that third level of guys that's maybe the reverse engineers and things like that. And then you also have the intelligence team that's kind of looking strategically over long periods of time for things to pop up. Well, you're building a way to retain your staff, because you're giving them a career path, and that's something that we don't have, and we don't do a good job of retaining staff. So I think that, plus this is people want to be involved in this, so staffing the team is important. A lot of different skill sets strengthen the team. Organizations that I talk to, from defense contractors to technology companies to financial services, have a wide variety. They don't just look at IT guys. Technical backgrounds help, and then they may bring some other people in. It depends on the skill sets that they want on their team. But business knowledge, regional cultural knowledge, obviously if you have scripting and programming capabilities, they'll be great. A lot of the tools, and we'll talk about a few of them on the call today, scripting and programming capability will allow you to get more out of them, whereas other organizations that don't have those type of skills may have to rely on a vendor. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good integration in the vendor landscape today. I also see a big trend of former Intel analysts and officers getting recruited by firms. MSSPs are bringing them in. These large companies are bringing them in. People want to leverage their experience, particularly those people that have fought this APT level state-sponsored attacks. So the next component that I want to talk about is establishing intelligence sources. And for those of you that are doing intelligence today, because I'm sure we probably have a wide variety of people on the call, and like I said, I wanted to try to have the widest swath to talk to both, executives, management, to practitioners, some people that are doing this today and some people that aren't. You've got to establish your sources. And so what I do is thought I'd run down a couple of different areas that I recommend people look at. Some of these you are already doing. They're going to be very, very obvious. But one that I think is important, and I observe this in my research interviews, and it's intuitive as well, is your internal employees. There's this big drive to get external threat intelligence, and we want that, right? That's great. But we get this perspective from our employees on how this external actors are hitting us. So we want to leverage our employees, and a lot of people don't think security awareness has value, and I would disagree with that. I just don't know how much money you would invest in security awareness, but your employees are really your first level. And particularly if you got your standard user profile, but then you also have your IT people that are tech savvy, right? And then you have email lists set up internally, and you're letting them know about alerts and things like that. A lot of my clients have intelligence programs for large multinational distributed organizations, so they have a very mature way to distribute information within their own organization. The other piece is the log and network data, and I think let's not forget about that, right? And this also speaks to the maturity of your organization. The examples that I put there with network behavior, DNS logs, your firewall drops. A lot of people don't do firewall drops in their SIMs because it raises your events per second, so it raises the cost. But the firewall drops are very helpful. Obviously, the web proxy logs are very useful, and then just your HTTPD logs are very useful, so don't discount the internal stuff. From the government side, right, we know we've got the FBI and the Secret Service. Now, I will tell you from personal experience in working with FBI and incidents, that's a one-way street, right? You give them information, you don't get anything back. It kind of that speaks to what we're all talking about, intelligence sharing right now. The national security organizations is very similar. You've got your CERT teams, and then you've got your certs within companies as well. The industry piece, is kind of lead on to that, I think is important. If you don't have, and I think the informal play, the third one there is probably the most important, and when you go to conferences like this conference that we're going to have in DC, when you go to Black Hat, when you go to RSA next week, God bless you if you're there, that's where the informal relationships get to know people, and then you start sharing information. I think that's absolutely critical. I work with a lot of Forrester clients that they have large you may not know about them unless you're in that industry. They're not public, but they do lots of information sharing strategy together. If you don't have that in whatever your vertical is, I would definitely recommend that you seek that out. Open source, and so we talked about OSINT a few slides ago. This is the part where I think a lot of organizations actually can kind of kick the tires a little bit. You have a couple different options too. There's lots of public threat feeds that are out there that you can get, right? DShield, Spam House, Zeus Tracker, Shadow Server, tons and tons of ones that are out there, and you could collect those, aggregate them yourselves, and we'll talk about SIF in a little while to that end, so people can do that. Then you also got your in-house collection that you might do, and I have customers doing this, right? They've got sock puppets up in chat rooms or whatever, and one of my clients, I guess a use case that they use is they had a sock puppet from some of the hacktivist groups, and so when the Strat4 incident happened last year, they had sock puppet up in an environment. They found out about it about 2 days before Christmas Eve when I found out about it on Twitter, because I was a Strat4 client actually, and so they were able to get the list of email addresses to people that were compromised, and then look at who was in their company and put some security controls around those individuals for a little bit more monitoring and gave them a heads up. So, kind of an actionable step that someone was doing with this. And we'll talk about this throughout the process too. The OSINT, there's a lot of organizations that won't do this. They just don't have the scale. You have several different, on the maturity kind of, or I don't know if maturity is quite the appropriate word, on the scale of customers, right? On the far end, you've got the defense industrial base, those type of guys, financial services. Then you've also got the companies that it's a security person of one, and he is the incident response guy, and he wears other hats, and he's going to be doing this. So many organizations, a threat feed could be the extent of what their intelligence capability will ever be. The vendor landscape, I'm sure we'll see it next week, lots of it's threat intel in a box type of things, but a lot of companies will never build up multiple staff to do this. And they'll start relying on the commercial piece. And actually, I'm doing a whole line of research. What we're talking about today is my first kind of iteration of research into this area. And what I'll be adding on to in the future is a deep dive on the commercial. I'll basically doing a market overview on all the vendors that are out there. And this is actually changed. There's a lot of vendors I don't have included on it. But you've got people that do the threat feeds, as we kind of talked about. And what they'll do is they'll parse and dedupe and aggregate that stuff for you. You've got software as a service vendors, and actually Visible Risk does some of this as well. Mandiant acquired Unveilance last year. You've got Secular, where it's cloud-based. They're giving information that's specific to your organization. They're hunting for things for your organization. Then you've got a wide range of other kind of providers that are out there. Dell SecureWorks, your MSSPs are making a play here. You've got a company like iSight Partners, the founder of iSight founded iDefense. They do a lot of human intelligence collection, OSINT collection, and deliver reports based on types of playbooks that you might have to worry about. You've got Looking Glass that has a combination of cloud-based services and some on-prem stuff. RSA has really been ramping up their services here for a company that's traditionally had a go-to-market strategy through their through their reseller channel. Now they're rolling this up. Then I mentioned iDefense as well. Everyone, last week on Twitter, I was, saying, I think I talked to 3 vendors in 3 different days that were standing up this kind of capability. So I think it's important for us as analysts to go out and show some differentiation, because we recognize that many, many people are going to be leveraging the services because they just can't bring it up in-house. So let's move on to the deriving of the intelligence piece. So actually, how do you go about doing it? And I'm going to point you, this is going to be high level as well, but I'm going to point you to a number of different resources. Now probably, it's interesting, when I talk to people that are, in the game, so to speak, or in the bubble, analyst bubble, whatever, the Twitter DFIR bubble, everyone knows about the cyber kill chain, right? But I think there's a large majority of my clients that don't know about that, don't even know about IOCs and what they mean. So we've got different levels of maturity that are out there. If you haven't seen this report, which basically establishes the cyber kill chain from Lockheed Martin, I highly suggest you do it. Actually, at the conference on the 22nd of next month, Mike Kloppert, who helped write this, will be hosting a panel that I'm on with individuals from Google and maybe one other company, but whatever, talking about best practices and things of that nature. So this is almost required reading, and this is where you basically, you don't try to stop exfiltration. Obviously you do, but you want to start at the reconnaissance phase, and there's all the steps from recon to exfil, and you actually would map out, to my point earlier about return on investment, you map out where your security controls are in the various stages of an attack, and you can look at the success there. So if you haven't read that particular piece of research, I highly recommend it. It should be required reading for anyone that's doing intel stuff and incident response. If you kind of move on, I thought I would talk about a couple tools that are out there today. As I said, one of the problems that I think exists that makes using intelligence challenging for the majority of companies out there is that you have to have programming, scripting skills in a lot of cases to maximize this stuff. And that is a very unique skill set, right? We know that we have a hard time finding good security people. And so a lot of these tools need that kind of skill set to maximize them. And the vendor community, and like I said, next week at RSA, we'll see threat intelligence blinking lights. It needs to do a better job. I mean, our SIMs out there need to do a better job of being able to pull in external threat intelligence information, data that we have brought in ourselves, and be able to search and parse through that type of stuff. So the first one that I would bring up is the Collective Intelligence Framework, and this is CIF. And forgive me if you're already familiar with it, but I talked to many people that aren't. I was actually, by the time I got vetted to join REN-ISAC, I actually left, I think a month later, left EDU. But I was a member of REN-ISAC, and when we were using it, I didn't get to use this particular tool, but it basically parses public and private feeds. So you could have a feed with your peer in, I don't know, in oil and gas, and you guys could have a feed where you're sharing information there, you're setting up your own infrastructure. But you could basically aggregate your spam house, your shadow server, all those public feeds. And then you can query those feeds for your hosts. You know, what do we have that's on this list? One use case that I've got clients using on this is the third party. You know, their third party risk, my CISO clients, it's one of their mobility third party risk are probably their number 1 and 2 concerns right now. And so being able to say, look, here are the people that have extranet connections to my environment. We already know that if someone wants my information, they're going through third parties, or they can, you know, Bit9, RSA. So they're using this to get a state of what this third party looks like. I have clients that will leverage this type of approach for M&A activity, and they want to get a state, because by the time the security team gets any kind of internal documentation, it's kind of late. If they hear something's happening, they can use this public information and get a good idea of what they may be taking on. And then you can use it to feed your detective and preventive control. So you can create snort rules out of this stuff to block. So it's basically a collaboration with the National Science Foundation and the REN-ISAC, which is if you're not familiar, it's the ISAC for EDU. I have a friend of mine, a CISO for a large multinational company. They're getting into this space. He actually, what he does, and I think this is great, is he brings in college grads from the University of Texas at Dallas from their CS school. Doesn't have to pay them a ton of money, pays them appropriately. And they basically will do all of the internal programming, scripting that's necessary to maximize this and some other tools as well. So he pays, you know, not what he would pay for a full-on, basically he's got this staff on his incident response intelligence team. So that might be an opportunity for you to bring someone in, maybe an intern, but you may not want to trust an intern. It kind of depends on your policies, but that could be an option for you. And then CIF has integrations with Splunk and ArcSight as well. Kind of moving on, another tool, and many people I talk to aren't familiar with MeltyGo either. I tool around it with MeltyGo since I'm not a practitioner, so to speak. You know, my stuff's more fun, just looking at interesting things. But MeltyGo is an open source intelligence and forensics application. It's a commercial product. You can get a community version of it. But it basically visualizes relationships between people's groups, websites, network block information, documents, and files, and looks for relationships. And it's very, very, very interesting. You know, I know MeltyGo, they just, I saw it on the blog, maybe it was yesterday, they were taking some of the stuff from the IOC dump from Mandiant and plugging it in. And then Palantir, if you haven't heard of them, they're a big data platform, commercial, so is MeltyGo, but that's used for similar purposes a lot by the government. I have a screenshot of MeltyGo here. I kind of went too far back. Let's see. Okay, I don't know how I jumped that many of MeltyGo, but you can see this nice little GUI. It makes and they're called transformations or transforms. They do different types of activities. So I highly recommend you take a look at that if you're not familiar. Building versus buying. You know, right now today, it's the defense industrial base, financial services, technology companies that have this kind of capability. Oil and gas and pharma, I see moving into it. But most organizations are not going to build out robust teams. They just don't have the operational capability to do it, and economics and spend comes into it. As I said earlier, that kind of CTI as a service is going to probably be for a lot of customers the extent that they go on it. This will be your traditional kind of build versus buy conversation. People that have MSSPs, they're going to use the MSSP service for it. So OPSEC. So this is kind of great timing with what happened this week with Mandiant. So right, we know the more people that know a piece of information, the less value it has. So we know Mandiant released this. I still haven't finished. I'm actually going to finish it on the way to RSA on Sunday night. Released this, and I think it's huge. And this time we're all clamoring for more information sharing. Mandiant did this, particularly also for me. I'm a fan of it, having a military background in serving the country. I think it's nice that it comes out. Personally, just because you're talking about this group doesn't mean you ignore that there's other APT actors that are out there. But what you've seen since this is a lot of other groups are sharing their information or resharing their information, because others have shared some of this stuff on the comment crew in the past. But I hope that this is going to change kind of the approach that we have for sharing, and hopefully we can do it without government intervention. I'm kind of cynical as far as that goes. But they released, the fully qualified domain names, MD5 hashes, SSL certs, indicators of compromise. I think this is actually going to do a lot for just people learning what IOCs are, because like I say, a lot of clients that don't do this all the time, they don't know what they are. So Mandiant's open IOCs, basically a schema for sharing. Mandiant open sourced it. They actually had a webcast yesterday on changes that are going to be made to it, although I was unable to attend it, so I didn't know it. But you could actually use the IOC Finder, deploy it to your endpoints, pull the IOCs down from the appendices, and actually search your environment for indicators. And I think it's important to do that. Obviously APT1, who weren't the special forces of the Chinese threat, they're going to change their TTPs. But if you go back and look through your environment, the fact that you were targeted is going to be pretty important. But there's more than just Mandiant that's out there. There's a number of frameworks for sharing IOCs, and I think the important thing is that you use one, whatever that may be. MITRE has a couple that they use as well. Cybox for cyber observable expressions, and basically this is also another framework for sharing. When Mandiant open sourced OpenIOC, they built that into the Cybox library. You could actually use a tool called IOC Extractor available on GitHub to pull down the IOCs that Mandiant released and then create them in a Cybox format. Here's just a picture of the schema that's out there, which could be out of date as well. Last year at Black Hat, MITRE introduced Sticks, which is being tested right now from US CERT and FS-ISAC. And I'm hoping to meet with some folks next week from the FS-ISAC to actually get some feedback on where this is going. We have all these competing frameworks out there for sharing. I think the important thing is that we share and you look at which framework is going to be most important to you. This looks to have a little bit more robust sharing capability with more context than IOC specifically from an incident response perspective. And then just a kind of a screenshot of what their schema looks like. Another one that I didn't do a slide on is IODEF, which is the Incident Object Description Exchange format, which was set up for CSERTs to exchange. I think the important thing to remember is that we need to be sharing information, right? It's great to pull down the Mandiant IOCs and things like that and search for IOCs with your environment, but you need to have you need to build these relationships. You have to build trust, and trust is the most important thing to share. One thing I would say on the OPSEC side is depending on what type of attack it is, you're not going to share the information. And if you haven't read, I think I mentioned it, Richard Bailick's article in Forbes yesterday or the day before talking about why they felt okay sharing APT1 and didn't share some of the other APT groups they tracked. It's because they were much more skilled. And if they were to release that information and how they're tracking them, that intelligence would lose value. So they released the intelligence that they felt comfortable from an OPSEC perspective, and they didn't want to compromise their IOC sources that they have. So that's an important piece. So recommendations, and we'll go through this, and then we'll have a chance to go through some conversations as well. So I think the first thing is that leveraging intel is going to make the attacker's job more difficult, right? We may not win, and obviously winning has been redefined, but we can cause pain for the bad guys. From a recommendations perspective on things that I think the first thing that I would say is this is on the Mandiant piece. A lot of people are going to take, and have already done this, and they're going to use all of those appendices data that was released by Mandiant, and they're going to search their environments. I think, and that's good from a tactical operational perspective. If you don't have an intelligence function today and you want one, I would use this as a strategic opportunity. This has made so much news that I think it's on the level of the, well, I'd say it surpasses it debatably on the Sony PlayStation breach. I'm trying to think of other gigantic news-catching ones. This, to me, is probably the biggest. But my point was, this is making it to the C-level people above the security guy. Because a lot of CISOs, they report to IT still, so they're pretty far down in the organization. Use this as an opportunity to build up the capability here to start getting buy-in, the steps that I had. I think this is a really good opportunity strategically to leverage what Mandiant has done to build out that program. The other piece is that you don't have to be the NSA or DoD. I've been talking about intelligence for, I don't know, pretty heavily with consulting and research for 8 months now, I think. And talking to C-level people, and I always get, we're not ready for it, we can't do it, why are we going to do this? The fact is, you don't have to be the NSA, Department of Defense, GCHQ to do this. Small organizations can do it as well. It may just be, hey, do you want to know what machines you have in your environment, or that you have machines in your environment that are talking out to Zeus? A lot of organizations don't know that. Even the commodity stuff, they're not aware of. And that's where you could use something like the SIP to monitor and then start blocking. Snort rules, we're monitoring, and now we're going to, in SourceFire, we're going to start blocking on the commodity stuff. You're going to have to think about, if you're going to start blocking, you develop some really nice intelligence on a very sophisticated attacker. The decision to go from monitoring to blocking is going to be, specific to the organization and whether visibility you have. But I definitely think we need to be moving to blocking the commodity stuff so that we can focus on the more important stuff. Share, share, share. I think you can't say it enough. We need to do some more sharing. I really hope that what Mandiant did is going to kind of open the floodgates from a sharing perspective between companies and without government intervention or oversight. We'll see how that goes. Use tools that meet the unique needs. I mentioned 2 tools here. There's a lot of open source tools that are out there, and once again, this kind of speaks about the challenges that we have in the space. We have lots of open source stuff that's out there, which open source is near and dear to my heart, coming from EDU. But for the mass wide audience, we need more than open source to be able to do this. So when I talk to vendors, and when you talk to vendors, you talk to your SIM vendors, start asking them, how can you consume threat intelligence information from feeds that we have internally developed, externally, whatever the case may be. We need to get away from these kind of point solutions that we really have. The final piece, and this one I talked to the CISO of a very, very large technology company, and they do this with great effect, is they provide quarterly and annual threat reports. So just in the past 2 weeks, what we've had, TrustWave had a report come out. Obviously, we had the Mandiant report come out. WebSense had a report come out. Cisco had a report come out. I mean, it's RSA season, so that's happening. Well, what about developing your own threat reports? Come up with your own threat reports that are specific to your organization. You can have multiple audiences. It's really important to know your audience. You can have a report that you're going to arm, your kind of InfoSec advocates that are out there in the field, and that has some more technical information. But I think what would be really, really important is to develop an intelligence product for your C-level people. And this is going to require some work from your CISO, and you guys are going to have to translate how this intelligence is delivering business value. But I think intelligence will give us the opportunity to show that we're doing a good job in security. Whereas, the only time you hear anything about IT and security specifically is when something goes wrong. Well, if you can establish regular cadence with them, you have a quarterly meeting, maybe you get 5 minutes to talk about the threat landscape. And we saw activity going after this particular business partner of ours that has our pharmaceutical intellectual property, but because we did blah, 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 we were able to stop that. I think those show wins, and you can do trending. So I think that's a really big piece that I would recommend that you do. And if you're not doing it, start talking up the chain of command to do it. The key thing to remember is they'll be back, right? I said next generation predator. So we have to always be ready to respond and constantly adapting what's going on. Now, if you have to have services, I did hear Gary Busey is now a principal consultant at Mandiant, so if you're bringing them in, you may have the luck of getting to work with him. I don't know what a good job he'll do, but he'll be out there. For me, before we move on to the questions in the last 10 minutes, one of the things that I was going to talk about, some of the more research I'm doing in this space. So I'm going to do one on proactive defense and the operational and management implications. management implications, which includes legal as well. I'm also going to do, as I mentioned, the market overview on threat intelligence services, where I also will explain some of the fees and things that you can do yourself. So to give that kind of, here's the scope of what you can consume and whatever you're capable of doing, you can do. And then I'm going to work with one of my colleagues at Ferrara who covers the managed service provider space, and we're actually going to do a wave on the threat intelligence capabilities of the Dell SecureWorks, the solutionaries of the world. So if your company is leveraging those, we'll dig deeper there. And with that, I think I've had the questions window minimized. I'm going to go on mute for a second and then turn it back over to Jason.
Hello, everyone. Right now, I'd like to open the webcast to the Q&A portion. If you have any questions, please feel free to type those to moderators through the chat window. And our first question is, Cecilia Anastas recently discontinued her nearly daily OS newsletter. Do you know of another similar quality newsletter?
I do not, but I subscribed to that particular one. To be honest, I've been so busy I haven't hunted anything down. But I feel the pain there because that was actually one of my enjoyable reads that were out there. I will do some investigation on that, and if I find one, I'll send it out on Twitter. And if anyone knows one, feel free to tweet me, and then I'll send one out to the rest of the followers, and I'll put the hashtag, although I don't remember what it is, for the summit. I'll put that on there as well.
And our next question, what is the target time frame for the Deep 5 on commercial intel sources? What forum is anticipated for releasing this information?
Time frame. So I always joke, vendors always appreciate this. I always say an analyst report time frame is a lot like a product roadmap from a security vendor, subject to change. It's something that I'd like to start on in Q2. I'm trying to prioritize. My goal is each quarter. I've got other research areas that I cover, is to cover a different piece on Intel each quarter. So my goal would be to start it in Q2. And actually, one other point I would make along those lines, if we've got vendors on here and I don't know about you, please follow up with me because I want to know about you. There's a lot of startups in the space. And then also, the other component that I would say is if you'd be interested in participating in a research interview on any of those topics, tweet me and I'd be happy to have a conversation there as well.
And our next question, there was a panel on threat sharing this past weekend at ShmooCon, and one of the greatest concerns with the need to share is that companies fear releasing IOCs and other information for two reasons. If this is their line of business, they're disclosing IPs, and they're worried about revealing attackable vulnerabilities within their own environments.
I wasn't at ShmooCon, but that topic constantly comes up. And what I have seen from a sharing perspective, and I think kind of the Mandiant piece indicates that as well. Mandiant released the information on one of the lower skill level of teams that were out there. Is you have what I've found, and I'll say I talked to some of you would know these technology brands, some of the top players in our space. They share with one other company. They're most important. We are getting a state-sponsored attack. They may share it with the government-type individuals, but they'll share it with one other company because they don't have that level of trust. They're concerned about those types of things. They're also concerned that if they share it with too many people, if it's a binary, for example, someone's going to load it up to VirusTotal, and then suddenly the bad guys may find out somehow. People are very wary of loading things up into cloud sandbox analysis, VirusTotal as well. So it's a very valid point. I think that's why trust is pretty important. I see a different mix of what people do. I see some people that share pretty widely from a cooperation perspective. So I've worked with some verticals that they're very candid in their sharing. But then I work with other verticals where they don't want to share with anyone in their similar vertical because they're competing against them. So I don't think there's any black and white answer there. It's something that you absolutely need to consider. And make sure that you have implicit trust in whoever you're sharing that information with.
And our next question, do you have any recommendations regarding process or procedure for using open source tools in the enterprise, like testing and validation, prior to deployment use or action based on use of the open source tools? How do we use open source without being... How do we use open source?
So that's a great question, and for me, I like the question too because I came from EDU. where we didn't have a choice, we didn't have money, so we had to use open source. So open source is near and dear to my heart. I think what I like about open source is that it's open, so in many cases you have more visibility with open source tools than you would have on the commercial side. I think the challenge that you have with open source, particularly in this area, is the skill set required to connect SIF and MeltyGo and IOC Extractor, different tools that are out there to maximize them, Perl and Python capability. I think those are kind of the skill set challenge is challenging there. One person I would recommend, if you don't read Kyle Maxwell's blog, Kyle's a fellow Texan and a Twitter buddy of mine. He does tons of stuff on this. So if you don't follow Kyle, I highly recommend you take a look at him because he digs into this stuff pretty deep. But it is a challenge. You're going to have the skill set to understand what you're doing, and then understand that the trade-off when you have an open source versus a commercial platform is there's more operations that's involved to manage them. You're doing it yourself. It's not the box that automatically gets updates from the vendor. You may have to cron it. You may have to do other things. So I really think in the open source stuff, it's just having the skill set to do it. Because if you have that skill set, you can automate a lot of the operational challenges that are associated with it. The good thing is because it's open source, and if you pick something that's been highly vetted in the community, then I think you'll be okay.
And Marcia asks, what is the article in Forbes that was mentioned?
Let's see. Do I still have it up? I don't remember the title. Yeah, I'm great help. I don't remember the title of it, but it was basically a follow-up to Richard Baitlick, question and answer. It actually gave a lot of good color. What I'll do is I'll find the article and I'll tweet it out. And I'll put the DFIR hashtag on it, and I'll put the whatever the hashtag is for the summit, which I think is CTI, SANS CTI maybe. So I'll find that out as well. I apologize, I don't remember it off the top of my head.
And our next question, I have some managers using their own home tools to support the company. Doesn't this introduce the risk of the employee? Doesn't this increase the risk to the employee and/or company? Rick?
Sorry, I was still muted.
That's okay.
I would say that any software that you use is going to increase your profile, your attack landscape that people have. Just think about the bit 9. So that's a challenge. Depending on where people are using it and what type of information is on that, that's probably something you want to think about. Make sure that people are connecting to the network in a secure manner if they're accessing secure data. It's kind of tough with a little bit more detail to get a little bit better perspective on that. But I would say, using an open source tool versus a commercial tool, it's still attack surface. So I would consider them probably similar there in that respect. Oh, I see one thing. Rob Lee, did he send it out to the whole group? Rob just did it. But the title of the article in Forbes is the Shanghai Army Unit that hacked U.S. targets likely wasn't even China's A-team. I think if you Googled China A-team in Forbes, it'll bring it up.
And our next question, if you release threat information, you can tell those who are threats what to change so they can remain an active threat.
Could you repeat that?
If you release threat information, can you tell those who are threats what to change so they can remain an active threat?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. Do you think you could maybe type it in again with a little bit more detail to help me out?
We'll move on to our next question. If you don't release threat information, you can be responding to out-of-date threats and miss active threats others are aware of. Do you feel that the open sharing of information is more important, or do you feel that we should only share some information with certain verified individuals?
Well, I definitely think that you should share with verified individuals, no matter what the case is. If it's the commodity stuff that's available on these public feeds, I think, suck those in, plug them into your controls and do that. But if it's, if it's more, just think about classifications of intelligence, right? You got your secret, your top secret, you got secret compartment information, you got all kinds of things that you get read onto. Depending on what that information is, what you should, now think about it, you should probably establish your own kind of intelligence classification. And just like we did in the military, where we would share certain levels of information with the UK, Australia, New Zealand, but we wouldn't share it with other partners. So actually, I should have probably put a bullet on there on the sharing piece of it. If you're going to share, develop an internal piece. If this intelligence is related to this type of program, it only goes to these people, or it goes to no people. So I think each organization should establish their own kind of threshold for sharing. But if you don't share with anybody, the intelligence is stale, and then it's not going to provide any value to other folks that are out there. And I think you also get a bit of quid pro quo, right? You share a piece of information with someone else, and then they share it with you the next time, and then you kind of build that relationship. So I think it's kind of baby steps of the quid pro quo and trusting and building that up. But I definitely think you need to have classifications of information that you would share.
And our final question, is there any trend towards companies reconsidering the BYOD paradigm and going back to the olden days?
I think a lot of people in IT like to think about that, but I don't see that happening. I think that consumerization wave is going to crush everybody, and we just have to try to do the best we can to secure it. The only people I hear, asking those type of questions are the IT people. You don't hear that from the business. You don't hear that from the C-level. Consumerization is here to stay.
Thank you so much, Rick, for your great presentation and for bringing this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we really appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.